Greetings everyone, this is the director, and here we have the review of Vikings, Season 1. Now, if you haven't seen the series of Vikings, and if you want to see it, then I'm warning you. Spoiler alert. Also, the depiction in Vikings displays a lot of human sinful immorality at its worst. Lukewarm religious self-righteousness, idolatry, human sacrifice, and there's little to no honor on any side. If you don't want spoilers, and you're disturbed by a lot of these foul practices within humanity, viewer discretion is advised. Now, I ended up slandering Vikings Season 6, especially Vikings Season 6B, and with good reason. So, why do I like this show? Why did I give such praise, even though this show is not entirely historically accurate? Even in the first two seasons, which I would describe as the only two seasons that were fantastic. Well, because I think it was historical or creative licensing done right. Alternate history done right. Especially as we don't know much about the personality of Ragnar Lothbrok, so this gives Michael Hurst the license to be as creative as he wants. And to tell the truth, what sources do we have? How is it that so many people are publishing so many sources on how the Vikings work with so many books? Well, we have the writings of the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, especially the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, writings of Bishop Asser, and even the writings of Muslims who were raided by the Scandinavian Vikings. Twice, in fact. All within the span of the same century. And trust me, a lot of people, they did not like the other Vikings. But the very first people who were raided by the Vikings were, ironically, other Scandinavians themselves. And contrary to what you hear in academia and the media, there have been constant changes within climate change. And as you can see by this chart here, there have been a lot of warm periods. And you see in that area with the dawn of the Dark Ages, around 500 AD to like 900 AD, this was practically a miniature ice age in and of itself. And it didn't exactly help those who lived in the cold, frozen north of Scandinavia that they all of a sudden had a population boom. And because they lived up so far north in frozen wastelands, can you imagine what they would do in order to try and provide for their clans and people? This was before the Norwegians and Swedes and Danes were even fully united peoples. So what do? They fight each other. So farmland was scarce and in great value. High in demand but low in supply, and so they would fight each other over what limited food and resources they did have. And this ended up leading to so many of them slaughtering each other for food that wasn't there. So at first, many of them started raiding each other, time and time again. But eventually, some of them, as they were desperate, ended up noticing that the Christian lands to the southeast and, not southeast, southwest and to the west of them seemed to be more prosperous in comparison to the poorer Scandinavian lands. So, at one point in the beginning of Season 2, this idea that Ragnar points out is, ironically, the idea that many of the Scandinavians in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden eventually came to. Why fight each other when they can fight people outside of their closest relations among the Scandinavians? Why not plunder outsiders rather than plunder each other for what scarce resources they already have? And if you've seen Vikings, you'll know where I'm going here. This is where Ragnar Lothbrok convinces Floki to build the first longship. Technically, he didn't build the first longship, but many of them gathered together, and they did build ships that were revolutionary for those times. They could go over the open seas for miles and miles, where most ships had to stay close to shore. And not only that, but they could sail upriver and outmatch anything that Charlemagne's navy could do so, and Charlemagne's empire was pretty much the dominant world superpower in Europe at that particular time and age. So, as you can see, this is why they were in and out before many of the armies could stop them. Now, when it comes to the sources from the various books we read, like my book, Celtic Saxon and the Vikings, and Viking Wars, War and Peace and King Alfred's Britain, where do many of these historians get their sources from? Well, they obviously get it from the writings of the Christians and Muslims who were raided by the Vikings. The Visigoths, the people of Al-Andalus, the Franks, the Picts, the people of Dalriata, and the Anglo-Saxons, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, writings by Bishop Asser. But a lot of the stories by the Vikings were the Viking sagas. Now, how accurate these Viking sagas were to the original writings, Oh, right. These sagas were the original writings, and unfortunately they were written down hundreds of years after the Viking Age was over, and they were passed down from oral memory. So, how much of it was changed in the mind of one individual to another? Who can tell, especially over 400 years? So, as a matter of fact, how do we tell how accurate this is? Ever played that game where one whispers a story into somebody else's ear and it goes on and on to another individual, and by the time it comes back to the first individual, it's like a completely different storyline? That's basically what the Viking sagas were like. So it's very difficult to try to connect them with the sources of the Saxons and Franks and everybody else to see how accurate these sagas are. And so a lot of times they're trying to be more accurate to the sagas than they are to real history. So, in some ways, this reads a lot more like a fairy tale. Especially when they're passed down from generation to generation for over... Like, remember that scene in Madagascar? That's basically what the sagas were like.
She's got a gun! Let's get out while we can! Pass it on!
He said, let's have some fun and take out the dam. Basset House.
Tell them no! Pull up! They'll kill us! There's gotta be another way! Pass it on!
They say no, pull up. Kill us. There's no other way. Basset House.
But, to tell the truth, I'd say it is a well-developed storyline, especially as Ragnar Lothbrok comes across and confronts the leader of his clan in the small, tiny village of Kattegat, the Jarl, Earl Haraldsson. Now, Ragnar Lothbrok starts out as a peasant farmer, and that's what many of the raiders actually were, peasant farmers. And so he suggests, why not attack the west instead of raiding the east, which is pretty much stripped bare of all of its wealth and prosperity. And Earl Haraldsson finds it, or thinks it to be a suicidal venture. But Ragnar Lothbrok suggests, well, our people are pretty much poor anyway, so why not take the chance to see if we can improve our lives here? But in the process, Earl Haraldsson misinterprets this as a threat to his power because the loss of his two sons has made him paranoid, to the point where he even questions the loyalty of Ragnar Lothbrok, despite the fact that Ragnar Lothbrok has been nothing but loyal to him. As a matter of fact, this is not accurate here, because the Scandinavians already knew of the existence of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Frankish Empire, especially since Charlemagne tried and failed to invade Denmark. So why is it that they make it that Ragnar Lothbrok goes off and discovers England? Well, because that's part of the storyline. Ragnar Lothbrok risks his savings like a businessman for a new venture, and in the process takes a new longship, and this is where he and his band of raiders from Kattegat discover the English monastery at Lindisfarne, and they raid Lindisfarne. Technically, this could not have happened, and Ragnar Lothbrok was not at Lindisfarne. Or was he? Because some historians suspect that maybe Ragnar Lothbrok was multiple Ragnars. But let's just say, hypothetically, that there is one Ragnar that most of the sagas are based off of. And it accurately captures the brutality. However, what happened in real life was much worse. It turns out that the monks ended up seeing the arrival of the Scandinavians, and they're like, "All right, our favorite customers come back to trade." And then the Scandinavians show up and they're like, "Nope, you're dead. We are getting all this for free. Nothing personal, it's just business." And then they slaughtered the monks there. Those who made it back to the monastery were captured, killed, and enslaved. And it can be accurately described the horror that was experienced in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle if we look at the year 793. This year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians, terrifying the people most woefully. These were immense sheets of light rushing through the air, and whirlwinds and fiery dragons flying across the firmament. These tremendous tokens were soon followed by a great famine, and not long after, on the 6th day before the Ides of January in the same year, the harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God and his holy island by rapine and slaughter. Sigurd died on the 8th day before the calends of March. Now, many Christian theologians and even some Christians today suspect that perhaps these Viking raids were God's judgment on the sins of many of their own people. And I believe that, because you want to know the first or one of the major structures that was destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar carried Judah off into exile? They destroyed the temple that was built by King Solomon. Simultaneously, this church at Lindisfarne was the missions headquarters of St. Cuthbert, one who led many of the Northumbrians to Jesus Christ. So, even within a short time, many of them had fallen back into idolatry or only worshipped Jesus as another god alongside Woden and Donar. But I have another theory that this was God's judgment on both the Christians who were acting lukewarm in their faith and the Scandinavians who had forgotten the God of their ancestors for over thousands of years. Because I believe that Odin existed as a human being, and the devil introduced the idea that man is God rather than God being God. Which is why I believe that first it started out as ancestral worship, which evolved into a pagan pantheon of the Aesir and Vanir. Because if you ever watch Marvel's Thor, one of the characters says that primitive cultures, like the Vikings, probably mistook the Asgardians for gods. Plus, pagans and even Christians alike, like Alfred the Great, claim to be descended from Odin or Woden. Though unlike their pagan counterparts, the Christians acknowledge that Woden was human and descended from Noah and his sons of the ark. And that's sadly what happened to all the descendants of Noah and his sons. Many have fallen into idolatry until God re-revealed himself to Abraham.